The first time my husband broke my face, I was not crying because of the slap. I was crying because I saw my own forged signature on a $480,000 consent form lying on our kitchen table, still warm from the printer. I remember the sound the paper made when it slid toward me, a soft whisper that felt louder than Ryan's voice. I was on the kitchen floor, my cheek throbbing, the metallic taste of fear still in my mouth, and that single sheet of paper stared back at me with the looped letters of my name copied and pasted from an old mortgage refinance file. Ryan stood above me, breathing hard, rubbing the back of his hand like I had bruised him instead. He muttered that if I had just signed the transfer when he asked, none of this would have happened. Behind him, Carol leaned against the counter with a glass of wine like she was watching a tired sitcom. She sighed and said that some wives make things harder than they need to be. Lacey sat on the bar stool, scrolling through her phone, and smirked without looking up. She said, "Sweetie, that is still your name on the paper, and that is what happens when the accountant in the house forgets who actually runs the money." Their words hit me harder than Ryan's anger. Not one of them looked shocked by the forged signature. They knew. They approved. They participated. I pushed myself up from the cold tile, holding onto the cabinet to steady my breath. I did not scream. I did not argue. I did not give them the scene they wanted. I simply wiped the corner of my mouth with the back of my hand and said, "I am going to bed." Lacey laughed under her breath and said finally, "She gets the lesson." But instead of walking upstairs to the primary bedroom, where I had once felt safe, I went straight to my small home office, shut the door quietly and locked it. My face pulsed, but my mind was clear, almost calm. I powered on my older laptop, the one Ryan believed was just a backup. Within seconds, my real life appeared on the screen. My LLC dashboard opened to the portfolio I had spent years building in silence. Total assets $1,835,000. 5 duplexes fully rented. A contract pending on a 6th. Partnerships with 2 housing nonprofits. A quiet financial life no one in the Lorne family knew existed. They thought the only money I had was the money I allowed them to see. They thought I was fighting for the last $480,000 in our joint savings. They had no idea that was the smallest piece of what I could lose and the sharpest weapon I could use. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the forged signature again in my mind. The betrayal seared deeper than the pain in my cheek. They had taken my trust, my savings, my labor, and twisted it into their personal bailout fund. They had mocked my job, called me just a paperwork girl, pretended my earnings did not matter. And tonight they crossed the final line. I opened my email and typed to Sonia, the only colleague I trusted. I wrote, "I need internal fraud eyes on a very personal file." She replied in less than a minute with a name that made my breath steady. Mark Ellis, Senior Internal Fraud Investigator. She added, "He can meet tomorrow morning. Are you safe?" I looked at my reflection in the dark screen. I did not look safe, but I looked awake. I set my alarm for 5:30. Then I walked back into the kitchen once the house quieted and the wine glasses were empty. I stood exactly where Ryan had stood when he pushed the paper toward me. The overhead light hummed softly. I could still hear Carol's voice calling my boundaries silly, and Lacey laughing that I should be grateful Ryan trusted me with money at all. I opened the fridge, took out eggs, butter, cinnamon rolls, and berries. I arranged them neatly on the counter the way I used to on peaceful mornings before everything rotted into toxic family noise. Tomorrow morning, I will cook them breakfast. I said it out loud, tasting every word. They will walk downstairs believing I have chosen obedience. I have chosen documentation. I washed my hands, touched my cheek lightly, and exhaled as the plan unfolded piece by piece. I imagined Ryan's face when he saw Mark sitting at our breakfast table. I imagined Carol's smile collapsing when she realized the signature she encouraged him to use would be examined by a professional whose job was to dismantle financial fraud. I imagined the first flicker of panic in Lacey's eyes when she learned her late-night bragging about family money would become evidence. I turned off the kitchen light and whispered into the dark, "Tomorrow the money will talk for me." And if you have ever watched a toxic family treat your savings like their playground, tell me where you are watching from and how old you are, because there are so many women carrying this kind of quiet financial injustice, and almost no one speaks it out loud. I used to believe that the first crack in our marriage happened the night Ryan shoved that forged signature across the table. But when I look back now with the kind of clarity pain forces into your bones, I can see the fracture forming years earlier, small and hairline almost invisible, unless you knew where to look. It began in 2016 when I was 27 and still thought love could soften sharp edges, the year we stood at the altar of a small church on the east side of Columbus, the stained glass catching spring light as if blessing us with a quiet promise. And afterward, everyone gathered in the community hall where the folding chairs squeaked and the sheet cakes were too sweet, and I felt like I was stepping into a family that might one day feel like mine. Ryan was a foreman, then proud of his calloused hands and the houses he helped frame, and I was already working as a mortgage loan processor at the credit union, the person who combed through tax returns and employment letters and debt ratios, believing in the simple fairness of numbers. Carol made her way to me that evening, her perfume a sharp floral cloud, and she squeezed my elbow as if I were a child being corrected, saying, "Now that you are part of this family, our money is our money. Remember that." And she smiled, but her eyes stayed flat, and I pushed the discomfort away because I wanted so badly to fit. A year later, in 2017, my Aunt June died after a brief illness and left me a small duplex near Westerville, a crooked little building with peeling paint and a soft spot in the floor of the upstairs unit. And when I told Ryan and his family about the inheritance, the first thing Lacey said was probably a money pit. And Carol added that old properties only trap young couples in debt unless they are smart enough to sell quickly, and they said it with the authority of people who believed they knew everything about property just because Ryan worked in construction. I ignored their smirks because I had spent years watching rates and markets, and I knew the duplex had potential, so I refinanced it, rolled the equity toward repairs, painted every room myself on weekends, and listed it for rent. And when the first tenants moved in and the rent checks started coming, I felt something solid forming under my feet that had nothing to do with Ryan or his family. In 2018, the first real test arrived when Ryan's company nearly lost a major contract because they were behind on taxes and short on supplier payments, and everyone in the Lorne family spiraled into panic. And I remember Carol crying at the kitchen island and saying, "We cannot let this happen. This family has worked too hard," and Ryan pacing the living room, insisting that the government was out to get small businesses. I sat quietly until I realized their desperation was real and that losing the contract might take our home with it, so I made a choice. I never told anyone outside my own bloodline. I pulled equity from my duplex, and through the LLC my Aunt June helped me set up, lent the company enough to stabilize cash flow for 3 months. It was a no-interest deal, and the only condition I asked for was a written record of the loan, nothing dramatic, just a signature and acknowledgement that the money came from my property, not theirs. They signed reluctantly, and then in the following months they only paid half of it back before pretending they had forgotten the rest. But what stung far more than the missing money was how they told the story to everyone else, spinning it into a tale of Ryan and Carol, pulling the company through a storm with grit and sacrifice, while I was thanked with a perfunctory nod as if I had handed over a $20 bill instead of the roof over my own financial future. After that, I started saving harder, funneling everything I could into our joint account, and my 401k working late, turning down vacations, trimming our grocery budget, telling myself that one day this would protect us from whatever chaos came next. But deep down, I think I already understood that the chaos was inside the family itself, not outside. Every holiday meal or birthday dinner came with new little stings, new reminders that they saw me as a convenience rather than a partner. Lacey would laugh across the table and say, "You are not even a real banker. You are just the girl who pushes buttons on mortgages." And Carol would sip her iced tea and add, "Real money is in property and inheritance, not in your little spreadsheets." And I would hold my breath and swallow the familiar heat in my chest because I knew more about debt to income ratios and risk assessments than either of them, yet they treated me like a child pretending to play financial advisor. I kept working, kept saving, kept building the quiet foundation no one else knew existed. Sometimes when the house was silent at night, I would remember the afternoons spent with Aunt June driving through quiet neighborhoods, looking at small rundown properties she said had soul, and she would rest her hand on mine and say, "One day, these little boxes will be your quiet revenge if anyone ever underestimates you." I never understood then how accurate she was not until the first unit was fully rented, then the second, then the third, and little by little. The LLC grew until I held 5 properties under my name alone. I never flaunted it, never mentioned it, never contradicted Carol when she told people I was lucky, Ryan provided for me, never corrected Lacey when she joked that I would starve without the family pot. I let them underestimate me, because underestimation is a kind of camouflage that protects and reveals at the same time. Now, as I sit here remembering the early years, I can see how the story formed itself long before Ryan forged my signature or raised his hand at me. I had rescued them more times than they would ever admit, and yet they retold the story as if I were the one being rescued. And every time they did that, something inside me tightened a little more until the resentment became a living thing. They believed without their guidance I would be lost, but the truth was the opposite. I was the safety net. They never thanked the quiet structure holding up the family they thought was holding me. And once I realized that truth, the outrage settled deep into me like a seed, waiting for the right moment to sprout. By the summer of 2022, I had already learned how to keep my face still when I was being dismissed, how to hold my breath in my chest so the sting of their words would not rise to my eyes, and that strange talent became useful. The afternoon Ryan's family hosted their annual neighborhood barbecue, a loud, messy gathering where folding tables sagged with casseroles and cheap paper plates curled in the heat, while neighbors drifted in and out of conversations about rising property taxes and whose kids were applying to Ohio State. I remember standing near the grill with a glass of iced tea sweating in my hand, while Ryan flipped burgers, proudly telling anyone who would listen how well the business was doing, and Carol floated from group to group retelling old family stories in a way that made the Lorne name sound like a local dynasty rather than a small contracting business that had nearly collapsed several times. When she reached the group I was in, she placed a manicured hand on my shoulder and told the neighbors that Ryan not only kept the company afloat, but also took care of me, because marriage was about providing and leadership. She launched into a polished version of the story she liked to tell at every social event, the one where Ryan selflessly paid off all my student loans when we got married, and how grateful I was to have a husband who understood responsibility. And I felt that familiar twist low in my stomach because she said it with the easy confidence of someone telling a universally accepted truth, even though the reality was that I had paid the majority of my loans myself through years of steady work, while Ryan contributed a single lump sum at the end, something I had thanked him for endlessly, but had never intended to become the defining myth of our marriage. I kept my eyes on the grass because interrupting Carol never worked. She treated correction as disrespect, and the neighbors nodded politely, some even offering the soft sympathies people give when they assume a woman relies entirely on her husband. The conversation drifted, and at one point a neighbor, a kind older woman named Jean, who had refinanced with me at the credit union, complimented me for being smart with money, saying I had helped her reduce her interest rate and arrange a better payment schedule, and before I could even thank her, Lacey appeared out of nowhere with that bright, sugary laugh that always sounded like a warning. She said, "Jean, she just moves money from her paycheck into our family pot. Ryan is the one who makes real deals." And for a moment, the entire group erupted in laughter. Not cruel exactly, but dismissive. the kind of laughter that turns a person into a caricature. The heat rose to my face faster than the July sun ever could, and I felt all the old humiliations stacking inside me every moment they had minimized me or twisted my work into something small. And I managed a polite smile, even though I felt like something inside me was being peeled back layer by layer. I excused myself to refill my drink, and when I turned away, I could hear Carol telling someone that I was lucky to have such a strong husband, because not many men these days wanted the burden of being the sole provider, and I gripped the plastic cup so tightly the rim cracked. The humiliation lodged in my throat all afternoon, sharp and sour, but a different feeling began to grow beside it, something steadier, something like a thin line of resolve. It stayed with me on the drive home when the car smelled of charcoal and sweat, and Ryan hummed along with the radio, unaware of the storm sitting silently, inches from him. When we walked into the house, the familiar sight of our living room pressed in on me. The framed photos Carol insisted we display, the throw blanket she gifted us embroidered with the phrase, "Family first." And as I stepped out of my sandals, I remembered a detail so ordinary it almost made me laugh. Every subscription they relied on, every service they used daily, almost every digital convenience that kept their routines running smoothly, all of it was under my name and my accounts, my credit, my monthly payments. Costco membership, phone family plan, Netflix, Hulu, even that premium account Ryan liked for sports, all mine, all paid from my salary, all taken for granted. I felt the exhaustion of years of being treated as a background character when I had been financing half the script, and a small, quiet idea took shape. Not revenge in the dramatic sense, not a declaration of war, but a gentle correction, a reminder of how much they leaned on the woman they liked to treat as ornamental. I went upstairs, opened the phone plan app, and with a few taps removed the 3 additional lines. Ryan and Carol and Lacey used lines they never paid for, lines they had often taken over on long calls without a second thought. Next, I changed the passwords on Netflix and Hulu, and the sports account generating new complex strings I knew they would never guess. I closed the laptop slowly, letting the stillness settle across the room, and I felt a strange calm spread through me. Not triumph, not glee, but something closer to fairness, as if I had shifted the weight back to where it belonged. The next morning, the house woke before I did, their voices rising through the thin walls, Ryan asking why the phone service was down, Carol complaining her grocery coupons would not load because the membership app kept rejecting her login, and Lacey sending frantic messages to the group chat asking if anyone else was locked out of streaming. I walked into the kitchen with a straight spine, poured myself coffee, and when they all turned to me with confusion and accusation mixing in their expressions, I simply said, "Oh, I thought since it is all family money you would handle it." And the silence that followed was so thick it almost felt like a blanket. They sputtered and demanded explanations and insisted I was overreacting, but I just sipped my coffee and let their frustration bounce off the quiet armor I had built over years of swallowing disrespect. It was such a small thing, cutting off a few services, reclaiming a handful of digital lifelines, but it shifted something powerful inside me. A subtle return of control, so long overdue, it felt like a forgotten language resurfacing on my tongue. By the end of the day, they had restored their own accounts through hurried purchases and irritated calls to customer service. But the moment stayed with me, the knowledge that I could push back in small ways without yelling, without breaking myself open. And that silent push was the beginning of something larger. The first ripple of rebellion in a life that had been too still for too long. The small victory of reclaiming those digital lifelines stayed warm in my chest for weeks, a quiet reminder that I was not as powerless as they wanted me to believe. Yet even as that warmth lingered, I sensed another shift happening beneath the surface of our daily life, something slower and more deliberate, the kind of change that creeps in, like humidity, until everything feels heavier without you knowing exactly why. By early autumn, I began checking the joint account more often, mostly to monitor deposits and bills, since Ryan claimed the business was entering its strongest season and he needed us aligned financially. But the more I looked, the more uneasy I felt. Transfers appeared every few days, small at first, then larger, all moving into an unfamiliar account labeled Lorne Reserve. Account, a name I had never heard, and certainly not one connected to any of our known finances. When I asked Ryan at dinner, he barely looked up from his plate, saying it was part of tax planning and that it was complicated and that I would not understand because I had never run a business, and he said it so casually that anyone overhearing might believe he was simply explaining weather patterns or lawn maintenance. I pressed once more, gently saying I like to understand where our savings went and that the amounts felt too frequent to be random, but he shook his head and gave that sigh. He saved just for me, the one dripping with condescension, and said that I should trust him because he had a better grasp of real money than someone who spent all day in a cubicle pushing numbers. Before I could respond, Carol chimed in from the living room, where she was folding laundry that was not hers, saying if Ava really understood money, she would be rich already, rather than stuck doing data work for other people. And she laughed, as if she had made a clever joke. And Lacey, scrolling on her phone next to her, added, I mean, she is smart, but she is not that kind of smart, and the familiar burn rose in my chest again. I swallowed it because revealing the truth about my portfolio would have felt like giving my best weapon away during the first round of a fight, and a part of me still wanted to cling to the fantasy that maybe they were just careless, not malicious. I continued monitoring the account, though, noting every transfer into that mysterious Lorne Reserve account, documenting each movement without saying a word. Then the twist arrived, not loudly, but in the soft fluorescent hum of my desk at the credit union. It was a Thursday afternoon near closing when a refinance packet came across my desk in the regular queue. Nothing unusual at first glance, just a thick file with tax forms and appraisal notes and the standard disclosures. I opened it absently and felt my heart jolt as if someone had dropped something cold into my chest. The borrower name at the top read, Ava Lorne. My name. My full legal name. But the mailing address was not ours, not mine, and Ryan's not any property we own together. It was Carol's address. My pulse stumbled in my throat as I flipped through the forms, seeing signatures that looked eerily like my own, just off enough that my stomach twisted, but close enough that someone could fool an underpaid loan reviewer at a busy lender. Social Security number matched mine. Birth date matched mine. Employment information matched mine, but with inflated income likely to boost approval chances. I felt a flush rise up my neck in slow waves as the realization settled brick by brick. They were using my identity, my creditworthiness, my personal information to secure a loan that had nothing to do with me, likely to cover business debt or overdue invoices or something even murkier. Betrayal is a word people use casually tossed around in breakups or petty arguments, but in that moment it felt like a physical force pressing on my ribs as if I were being folded inward around the weight of it. I thought of every time I had stepped in to help, every hour spent refinancing my duplex to bail them out. Every night I stayed late at work adding to our savings, and here they were turning me into a shield for their mistakes, a convenient credit line disguised as a family member. Family betrayal karma. The phrase flickered in my mind as I stared at the signature. The knowledge that the very people I had once considered my own were stripping me of financial autonomy, piece by piece, reducing me to collateral. I made myself breathe slowly. Then I printed the entire packet quietly, each sheet sliding warm and accusing into the output tray, and slipped them into my bag under a folder of blank forms. When I got home, I did not confront anyone, not yet. Instead, I went to the bedroom, closed the door, and took out a small binder I kept hidden in the back of the closet, the one I jokingly labeled, in case I forget who I am. Inside were the screenshots and bank statements I had begun collecting after the barbecue. Tiny fragments of a story that had not yet formed, but was starting to take shape in the dark. I added the refinance packet behind a plastic sleeve, smoothing it down carefully as if sealing a wound. I took screenshots of the transfer history from the joint account and printed them at work the next day, sliding those pages into the binder too. I photographed the loan packet again using my phone just in case the physical pages ever went missing, storing the files in an encrypted folder hidden beneath mundane apps. Each piece of evidence felt like a quiet acknowledgement of what I had been denying for years, that Ryan and his family did not just dismiss me or mock me. They used me, leaned on me, drained me, and now they were stepping into darker territory. Yet even as the rage simmered low in my stomach, I felt something steadier rise beside it, a careful patience, the instinct to wait, to gather, to prepare. I did not explode, and I did not confront them, because confrontation with them always turned into a performance, where they twisted facts and used volume as intimidation. Instead, I carried the binder back to the closet, placed it behind my winter coats, and whispered the label softly to myself like a mantra in case I forget who I am. Walking out of the room, I felt the shift inside me settle, fully a sense that I had crossed an invisible threshold. I had not acted yet, not openly, but something powerful had begun. The debt they were building, emotional and legal, was stacking higher with every passing week, and one day soon the weight of it would collapse in the only direction gravity allows down onto them. I kept moving through the days after discovering the refinance packet with a strange vibrating clarity, as if every sound in the house echoed a little too sharply, and every word carried an extra weight. And by the time the joint account balance dropped again, I knew I could not delay the confrontation any longer, because silence had become a permission slip they never earned. That night, the house felt unusually still, the kind of stillness that makes the refrigerator hum sound louder than it should, and I walked into the kitchen holding 2 printouts in my hand, one showing the balance from 3 months ago, when the savings still felt like a promise, the other showing the current number gutted clean, nearly $300,000 gone, as if someone had scooped out the middle of a fruit and left only a fragile rind. Ryan was sitting at the table scrolling through contractor invoices, while Carol sorted mail, and Lacey idled on her phone. And for a second, I wondered if I should wait until morning, but something in me refused to postpone one more truth. I placed the papers on the table in front of Ryan and said quietly that the withdrawals were not small, that this was not tax planning, that this was our entire safety net, disappearing without a single conversation. And he looked up at me with that practiced blend of annoyance and disbelief, as if I had interrupted him for something trivial. He lifted the papers, glanced at them sharply, then dropped them back on the table as if they were old receipts, and said he needed the money to keep the company alive, and that this was not a betrayal but a family obligation. And then he added a line that made the room tilt for a moment as he said, "We are family," right? So, of course, I can use the money when the family needs it. I felt the back of my neck heat as I asked why he had hidden it, and why the withdrawals were so frequent, and why he did it behind my back. But he cut me off with a shrug, saying I was overreacting and acting ungrateful. And before I could respond, Carol chimed in with a low, controlled voice saying, "If you ever leave, you will get nothing because family money stays with family." And Lacey looked up long enough to toss in a smirk and say, "Your little duplex will tank without our contractor discounts anyway." Their words hit me in overlapping waves, a chorus of entitlement dressed up as tradition, and I realized they had rewritten the rules long ago, while I was still trying to follow the original script. I picked up the printouts again and pointed to the missing amounts, asking Ryan to explain every number, and something in his face flickered a crack in the mask, revealing the panic of someone who had already spent too much and needed me to stay quiet to prevent the whole structure from collapsing. Then came the next twist, subtle in delivery, but sharp enough to make my heart hammer, when Ryan leaned back, folded his arms, and said in a low voice, I know you have your little properties and your little tenants and your little LLC. Do not think I do not see you sneaking around with those folders of yours. And if you blow this up, I will go to every one of your tenants and tell them you are a fraud, and I will make your precious portfolio worthless." For a second, the room spun, because that sentence meant he knew, maybe not the full scale, maybe not the numbers, but enough to threaten it enough to make me understand that the secrecy I had depended on was thinner than I'd imagined. I had. Carol's eyebrows lifted just slightly, as if she had heard a secret she should not have, and Lacey's smile widened, the kind of smile someone wears when they think they have found leverage. I felt something cold coil inside me. Not fear exactly, but a tightening awareness that the dark tunnel I had entered months ago had just narrowed, and I was now walking it not alone, but under surveillance. I tried to respond calmly, saying he had no right to use my information or my assets as bargaining chips, but he stood abruptly and slammed his hand on the table, hard enough to rattle the silverware. And before I could step back, he grabbed my wrist and yanked me closer with a force that startled even him, because he froze for a fraction of a second, then shoved me backward, as if the momentum had taken over his body. My back hit the counter, the world blurring in a bright flash, and Carol muttered, "Well, if she had just cooperated, we would not be here." And Lacey muttered something about me being dramatic, while my breath caught in my chest from the impact. The echo of the moment in the hook returned sharply the night he had broken my face over the forged signature. The same air, the same kitchen light, the same lack of shock in their eyes. I steadied myself on the counter edge and felt the trembling start in my hands, not just from the pain, but from the deep slicing realization that any illusion of safety I had held onto had dissolved completely, because they had crossed not just one boundary, but all of them. Ryan stepped closer and hissed under his breath that I should stop pretending to be something special, because without him and his family, I would be nothing, that my properties would crumble without his contractors, that my professional life depended on his silence, and that he could destroy everything I had hidden if he chose to. I breathed slowly, the kind of slow breath you take when you know one wrong move will escalate everything, and I said nothing because nothing I said would matter in that moment. Instead, I waited, letting the rage gather quietly beneath the surface, gathering not like fire, but like pressure, dense and controlled. When I finally walked out of the kitchen, the house felt heavier, suffocating, and in the bathroom mirror I saw not just the forming bruise on my cheekbone, but the confirmation of something I had been circling for months. That fear was not what would keep me quiet. That fear had already done enough damage, and what I had now was something far more potent. The documentation he did not know existed, the proof that would flip every threat he made into a weapon I could use against him when the moment came. That night after the confrontation in the kitchen, when the bruise on my cheekbone had begun to darken and the adrenaline had dissolved into a deep, humming quiet inside my ribs, I walked into my small home office and closed the door gently, because I needed the sound of the latch to remind me that there was still one space in the house they had not taken from me, and I sat at the desk while the glow of the second laptop lit the room with a soft blue tint, making everything feel a little unreal. My hands were still trembling faintly, but the trembling felt less like fear and more like a current turning something shifting from survival into strategy. And I opened my email and typed a short message to Sonia, my colleague who understood risk in the way some people understand weather, and I told her I needed eyes on a deeply personal financial issue, and asked if she could connect me to Mark Ellis first thing in the morning. I hit send, and within minutes she replied with her usual steady tone, saying she could make the call and asking if I was safe. And I stared at the question for a moment, because safety was not a state, it was a choice, and I was finally choosing it. I drafted a second email directly to Mark, outlining just enough to make the urgency clear, without revealing the entire labyrinth of fraud, coercion, and betrayal that had been unfolding in my own house, and when I clicked send, I felt the tiniest drop of power return to me, as if a door I had forgotten was locked had clicked open. Then I opened LinkedIn, something I rarely did at night, because it usually reminded me of the two versions of myself I had become, the quiet loan processor who sat behind a modest cubicle under soft fluorescent lights, and the other, Ava, the one with connections across Ohio's housing network, the one who had built a reputation quietly through referrals, workshops, and community financial education events. As the page loaded, I saw the long list of loan officers housing advocates and financial counselors who followed me the comments on the last panel I had spoken at, the private messages from women asking how to recognize financial abuse before it swallowed their savings. And for a long moment, I let myself remember that I was not small, not replaceable, not powerless, in the way Ryan's family had spent years insisting. The bitterness of the night settled in my throat again as I remembered how many times I had used my network to benefit Lorne Home Improvements, how many clients I had subtly steered toward their services because it made Ryan happy and made Carol look at me with that brief, approving smile she so rarely gave, and I remembered how their business had survived hard seasons, partly because of the trust I had built with local lenders and homeowners who relied on my recommendations. I realized then that the second mini revenge had been sitting in front of me this whole time, a quiet lever I had never considered pulling, because loyalty had once meant something to me. And I clicked into the endorsement section and removed the one I had written for their company, the one that praised their reliability and integrity, and for the first time in years, I did not feel guilty. My next actions were slower, deliberate, and strangely peaceful as I went into the spreadsheet of potential leads I kept for client referrals and deleted the line with their business name. Then I opened email drafts and erased a half-written recommendation. And with each small deletion, I felt a thread loosen from the rope they had wrapped around me. It was petty in a way, subtle, almost invisible, but the impact would ripple, because trust is currency in my field, and pulling back even quietly would eventually starve the parts of their business that had depended on my credibility. I leaned back in the chair and let the realization settle fully, understanding that I did not need to strike loudly for the damage to land, that sometimes the sharpest revenge was the one no one witnessed until the consequences started arriving in their mailboxes and unpaid invoices. After closing LinkedIn, I turned to the real task ahead, the plan for the morning. The breakfast trap I had imagined in my head long before I admitted to myself that I would ever need to use it, and I walked into the kitchen still dim with midnight shadows and began gathering what I needed for the next day. I took out flour and cinnamon and sugar, lined the baking sheet for the rolls they all loved, the ones that made Ryan soften for a fleeting moment before the cruelty returned, and I cracked eggs into a bowl and laid out coffee pods as if I were preparing for a peaceful family morning rather than a detonating one. The motions felt surreal because while my hands moved like a dutiful wife, my mind sat somewhere entirely different, cataloging every document I had saved, every screenshot, every forged signature, every transfer, every lie that had been neatly tucked into the corners of our marriage until the corners began to rot. I set the table with placemats and plates, polishing the silverware in slow, patient strokes, wanting the scene to look ordinary so the shock would land harder when Mark walked in, and I arranged the napkins the way Carol liked them, folded, then placed the cinnamon rolls on the counter to rise overnight. The house was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy with unfinished business, and I looked at the kitchen where I had been shoved only hours before and felt a strange, steady calm wrap around me because I knew that in the morning, the narrative they had been writing about me for years would begin to fracture. I carried the laptop back to my office and plugged it in, ready for Mark's email confirmation. And as I turned off the light, I whispered to myself that the obedience they expected from me was an illusion, because what I had chosen instead was precision documentation and timing. Standing in the doorway, I glanced back at the kitchen one more time, the table set like a photograph. The cinnamon rolls waiting, and I felt a low, quiet determination rise in my chest as if all the versions of myself I had silenced were finally breathing. Then I closed the door gently and whispered under my breath, "Tomorrow, they will think I have chosen obedience, but I have chosen documentation, And for the first time in a very long time, I walked toward my bedroom knowing exactly who held the real power heading into the morning. Morning came with an unnatural quiet, the kind that presses against the walls before anything explodes, and I moved through the kitchen, slowly checking the cinnamon rolls, reheating the coffee, arranging the plates, so everything looked warm and welcoming. And as I placed the last cup down, I felt the calm settle over me, the way a surgeon feels before making the first incision. When I heard the front door open without a knock, the familiar heavy footsteps, the careless laughter, the sound of people who believed the world would always bend their way, I did not turn. Immediately, I let them enter the room and take in the scene, the soft morning light, the smell of cinnamon, the table set, as if I had spent the night repenting instead of preparing my own war. Ryan walked in first with a smug grin, his voice full of unearned victory as he said, "Good. You finally understood the words," dripping with the assumption that obedience had won, that fear had folded me neatly back into the role he crafted for me. And Carol slid into the chair at the end of the table as if presiding over Sunday service, tapping her nails against the wood, while Lacey wandered toward the rolls and picked one up without asking, biting into it like she deserved every comfort I provided. I let them enjoy the performance for a few seconds because the contrast would make what followed feel sharper. And then the doorbell rang, a clean, measured sound that did not belong to our usual chaos, and I walked to the door with steady steps. Mark Ellis stood on the porch in a press shirt with a leather folder under his arm and a laptop bag over his shoulder, looking like the embodiment of consequences, and when he introduced himself in that calm, professional tone as Senior Internal Fraud Investigator with Central Ohio Credit Union. I saw the first flicker of confusion cross Ryan's face as he asked what this was about. I stepped aside and let Mark in, and the shift in the air was immediate because his presence carried authority the way some men carry weapons, subtle but unmistakable. And he walked to the table without hesitation, setting down his folder and opening the laptop as he asked politely if we could all sit for a moment. The three of them looked at each other in silent panic, masked as irritation. And when they sat down, I took the seat across from them, not beside them, because I was no longer part of their formation. Mark clicked a few keys and began displaying a series of transactions on the screen, his voice steady and almost gentle as he outlined the suspicious transfers from the joint savings account, the pattern of withdrawals, the lack of accompanying documentation, the concerning timing, and then he slid a printed packet across the table showing the loan application submitted under my name with a mailing address belonging to Carol. And I watched Carol's face freeze the way water freezes, mid-drip, stiff, unnatural, almost cracking. When Mark explained that the electronic signature used on the refinance matched a signature extracted from a prior unrelated file, reused in a way that violated every lending guideline, Ryan began to shift in his chair, his jaw tightening as he tried to form words that sounded like excuses, but tasted like fear. Mark continued without pausing, noting the IP addresses linked to the loan application submission. One traced back to the Lorne Home Improvements Office, the other traced to the home Wi-Fi in this house, and each time he spoke, the room felt smaller, heavier, as if the truth itself were adding weight to the air. Then came the twist, delivered with a calmness that made it crueler when Mark said, effective this morning, all accounts tied to these suspicious transfers are temporarily frozen, pending a full review, and the silence that followed was not silence at all. It was the sound of their world cracking. Ryan shot up from his chair, demanding clarification, asking how he was supposed to run payroll, how vendor payments would go out, how the company was supposed to function, when the primary operating account was frozen, and Mark, unshaken, simply said that fraudulent activity necessitates immediate action for the protection of all involved parties, and that any hardship they experienced was the result of their own financial choices. Carol's voice turned shrill as she said this had to be a mistake, and that I clearly did not understand what I was doing, and Lacey chimed in with her usual sting, saying I had probably misunderstood something again because I was always too emotional about money, but none of them seemed to realize how ridiculous they sounded, screaming at a man who dealt with financial crimes for a living. I waited until their noise softened into gasps and accusations, and then I spoke my voice steady enough to cut through the chaos as I said I had already moved my paycheck and my tenants' rent payments to a different institution, and the word tenants landed in the air like a dropped glass. Lacey squinted at me and asked tenants, what tenants, as if I had confessed to harboring fugitives, and I looked at her with a calm that came only from having the upper hand and said yes. The little duplex you all laughed at got some friends. Nothing more, nothing less, a single sentence that revealed almost nothing but suggested everything. The shift in their expressions was instant, a mixture of confusion, suspicion, and dawning dread, and for a brief second I almost felt pity. But pity had no place here, because this was the moment they had earned one humiliation at a time. The breakfast table, once the stage for their smirks and commands, had become an evidence room. Cinnamon rolls, untouched coffee cooling as Mark took notes, asked clarifying questions, and requested supplemental documentation. Ryan tried repeatedly to regain control, raising his voice, pointing at me, insisting that this was not criminal, but a family matter. And Mark stopped him with a simple, firm statement that family does not override fraud statutes. Carol began to cry, not from remorse, but from the realization that consequences did not bend for her, and Lacey paced behind her chair, muttering about how I had set them up, how I had betrayed them, ignoring the fact that everything on that screen had been their own doing. Eventually, Mark closed his laptop and handed me a small card with an appointment time, saying he would need me at the branch that afternoon to formalize the complaint and complete the next steps. And when I stood up to follow him to the door, Ryan did not stop me. He just stared smaller than I'd ever seen him, like a man realizing he had spent years leaning on a pillar he believed was weak, only to discover it could pull itself out from under him at any moment. As I walked out beside Mark, the cool morning air felt like a clean slate pressed against my skin, and when I glanced back through the doorway, I saw Ryan still standing in the kitchen, shoulders slumped, face pale, and for the first time since marrying into that family, I understood the truth fully. Not just the truth of my documentation, but the truth of my power. And I let the door close behind me without a sound. The days after the breakfast trap unfolded in a strange rhythm where every hour felt both heavy and electric, because even though the freeze was in place and the investigation had begun, I knew the Lorne family would not sit quietly inside the consequences they had created, and true to form, it took less than 48 hours for their smear campaign to begin, starting with whispered comments in the church parking lot, where Ryan told anyone who would listen that I was obsessed with money and trying to steal his business, and that the freeze was just a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by an ungrateful wife who never appreciated how hard he worked, and he delivered those lines with the same practiced sincerity he used whenever he wanted to look like the victim. By midweek, he had taken the same story into a bar near the lumber yard, leaning in close to vendors. He owed money to insisting that I had sabotaged the company out of spite, painting himself as a hardworking man, married to a selfish woman who cared more about spreadsheets than family, and I heard it all secondhand from people who knew me well enough to question the narrative, but still felt obligated to warn me. Then Carol joined the effort with her own poisonous twist, calling me a gold digger with no kids who married into the family for security, and now wanted to tear everything down because I could not handle the pressure of being a real wife. And she said it loud enough at a community luncheon that a woman I barely knew sent me a message online asking if everything was all right. I read the words slowly, not because they hurt, but because they revealed exactly how desperate the Lornes had become, now that the scaffolding of their financial illusion was collapsing. And instead of responding emotionally, I let the logic settle in my mind like a stone in deep water, clear and undeniable. The twist came naturally, almost effortlessly, when I realized I did not need to counter their lies with shouting or public declarations, because I had something far more powerful, the truth documented in official paperwork, signed and stamped by institutions that did not care about family theatrics. And I selected a small group of key vendors, the ones who had the most to lose if they continued trusting a company under investigation, and sent each of them a brief email attaching the freeze notice and the initial complaint form, adding only a single line at the bottom that read, "For your records," while you decide who is really mismanaging your contracts. I did not embellish, did not accuse, did not explain, because the documentation did all the work, and within hours several vendors responded with polite shock and thinly veiled frustration that they had not known the extent of the problem. It was not revenge in the dramatic sense, but it was precise and deeply effective, a slow, quiet shift of loyalty away from them and toward the truth. The next mini-revenge came almost accidentally when I remembered that Carol had been using a credit card in my name, one I had opened years ago to help her build better credit, because she claimed she wanted to feel independent, though in practice, she mostly used it for grocery runs and occasional treats. And I logged in one evening out of curiosity and saw multiple pending charges at the grocery store. She loved all stacked neatly like a row of careless choices. Without hesitation, I lowered the credit limit from $1,200 to $50, an amount so small it would not cover a single bag of her preferred organic produce. And then I waited, knowing that the timing would hit exactly when she reached the checkout line. Sure enough, a friend who worked there later told me that Carol stood with a full cart when the card declined 3 times, and the line behind her began to grow restless, and Lacey had to call Ryan, who arrived, flustered and irritable, forced to pay with a card tied to an account that was likely under review, while Carol whispered loudly about sabotage and betrayal. I was not there to witness it, but the image of that moment lived in my mind with a quiet satisfaction, and in my thoughts I could hear my own voice saying, "Sometimes conflict justice starts in the checkout line." But the quiet victories did not distract me from the larger work that still needed to be done, the legal steps that would secure both my safety and my financial stability. And so I made an appointment with the domestic violence advocate at the community support office, a place I had walked past dozens of times without ever imagining I would need. And when I sat across from the advocate and told her about the forged signature, the threats, the manipulation, the stolen savings, and the night in the kitchen, she listened without shock because she had seen too many versions of my story to be surprised. She referred me to Harriet, a lawyer who handled cases of financial abuse within toxic family systems. And when Harriet entered the small office with a stack of folders and a calm, steady presence, I felt something inside me loosen, as if I had been carrying a weight I did not fully understand. After reviewing everything I had collected, she looked at me with a mix of clarity and urgency and said, "This is classic financial abuse paired with intimidation and coercion. You need a restraining order immediately." And instead of feeling fear, I felt relief, because finally someone named it for what it was. The process of filing the paperwork was strangely intimate, almost like confessing a long, kept secret. And though my hand trembled slightly as I signed each page, my vision stayed clear, my breath steady, and when Harriet slid the final form toward me and said, "Sign here for the RO request," I lifted the pen without hesitation, letting the ink shape the boundary they had spent years crossing. When the last signature dried, Harriet leaned back in her chair, her expression firm but gentle, and said, "You are not doing this out of revenge. Emotional. You are doing this out of survival." And in that moment, I understood that surviving was the first step of reclaiming everything they tried so hard to take from me. The morning of the hearing arrived with a gray sky that felt strangely appropriate, as if the weather itself understood that nothing about this day would be light. And I walked into the courthouse with Harriet beside me, her calm presence steadying the breath I kept trying to slow. And even though my hands trembled with the memory of everything that had led to this moment, My steps did not waver, because for the first time I was walking towards something instead of running from it. Inside the courtroom, the benches were half filled with people waiting for their own hearings, faces tense, eyes down. And when I saw Ryan, Carol, and Lacey sitting together in a row, they looked like a family, posing for sympathy. Shoulders drawn in heads, bowed slightly, as if rehearsing their grief. Ryan stood when I entered, offering a strained smile meant to look remorseful, and Carol dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, even though she was not crying, while Lacey shot me a look of manufactured concern, all of it a performance that might have worked on someone who had never seen the truth behind their walls. The clerk called our case, and we moved to the front. The judge seated with an expression that suggested he had no interest in theatrics, only facts, and when he asked me to explain why I was seeking a restraining order, my voice came out soft at first, then steadier as I described the forged signature, the missing $480,000 the nights of escalating anger, the threats to destroy my rental properties, and the moment he shoved me hard enough to bruise my ribs. I did not embellish, I did not dramatize. I simply told the truth in the same clear tone Mark had used when he revealed the fraud at the breakfast table. And as I spoke, I could feel the courtroom shift, a subtle change in the air, when the judge leaned slightly forward, listening more closely, and when the clerk typed more quickly to keep up. Then Mark was called as a witness, and he approached the stand with the kind of quiet authority that made even Ryan sit straighter, and he explained the financial pattern he had uncovered. The fraudulent transfers, the electronic signature, reuse the mismatched IP logs, and the contradictions in the loan documents, laying out the entire pattern of deceit in a simple, factual manner that made the story impossible to twist. After Mark stepped down, the judge called Joan, our elderly neighbor who had lived next door long enough to know the sounds of our household too well, and she walked slowly to the stand with her hands clasped tightly, her voice shaking as she told the court about the late-night shouting, the way Carol mocked me on the porch one afternoon loudly enough for Joan to hear the time she saw me sitting on the back steps with my head in my hands after Ryan slammed the door so hard it rattled her windows. As Joan spoke, I felt a strange mix of gratitude and shame, grateful that she cared enough to testify, and ashamed that she had witnessed so much of the collapse I had tried to hide. But the judge listened intently, nodding as she described the pattern of belittlement and cruelty that echoed everything I had endured behind closed doors. When it was their turn to speak, the performance began immediately, Ryan stepping forward with his head bowed, voice soft, saying he had been under extreme business stress and had made mistakes he deeply regretted, and Carol sniffled loudly, telling the judge they only wanted what was best for the family, while Lacey declared I was overreacting and misinterpreting family arguments as abuse, insisting that every family had loud disagreements and that I was taking things too personally because I had always been sensitive about money. Their lawyer leaned heavily on a narrative of business pressure, insisting that any financial irregularities were misunderstandings during a difficult period, and that the family dynamic had simply become strained under the weight of responsibility. But the judge's face remained unreadable, his eyes moving between the documents and the witnesses with no sign of sympathy. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his tone firm, and even stating that the evidence presented demonstrated a clear pattern of financial manipulation, coercion, and physical intimidation, and that the court could not ignore the seriousness of the situation. He granted the restraining order for 1 year, barring Ryan from contacting me directly or indirectly, and he extended the order to include Carol and Lacey for the purpose of preventing interference with ongoing investigations, and I felt a small, sharp breath escape my chest relief, cutting through me like clean air. Then the judge added that due to the financial irregularities uncovered, he was referring the matter to the State Financial Crimes Unit for further review, which meant the investigation was about to move beyond the credit union and into a realm where consequences carried more weight and lasted far longer. He ordered a partial freeze on remaining joint assets, allowing only basic living expenses from my portion until the investigation concluded. And when the clerk read the details aloud, Carol's face twisted into something between outrage and disbelief, while Ryan stared at the table as if someone had pulled the ground out from under him. But the moment that cracked the entire facade came after the hearing. When we stepped into the hallway, the echoes of other cases bouncing off the tall walls, and Carol hurried toward me with a stiff smile plastered across her face, grabbing my arm lightly as she leaned in and whispered, "Drop it, we will let you keep your duplex," as if she were offering me a gift instead of a threat. I looked at her for a long, silent second, letting her believe she had leverage, and then I tilted my head, offering the smallest tired smile as I said, "Which one?" And the instant the words left my mouth, I saw her freeze her eyes, widening as the realization hit that she had not understood the scale of what I owned, that her assumptions had been built on shadows, that she had underestimated me, not by inches but by miles. She stepped back as if the air had shifted, and I walked away without giving her the satisfaction of another word, because that single question had done what an entire argument never could. When I reached the end of the hallway, the weight of everything settled in a slow, steady wave. Not the crushing kind, but the clarifying kind. The kind that tells you the story has changed shape, and so has the person living it. And for the first time, the people watching my journey would see clearly that I was not the fragile woman they once imagined, but someone with resources, strategy, and power they had never bothered to understand. The weeks after the hearing moved with a strange, heavy momentum, as if every action taken by the Lorne family now carried an echo of consequence they could not outrun. And even though I tried to focus on work and keep my days steady, the updates that filtered back to me painted a picture of a company beginning to crumble from the inside, a structure built on denial finally facing the weight of its own truth. The partial freeze meant their payroll bounced twice in a single month, and by the third week, vendors who had once extended them generous terms began demanding immediate payment. Their patience worn down by years of late checks and now sharpened by the documentation I had quietly circulated. Ryan responded the way he always did when pressure mounted, with loud decisions disguised as leadership cutting hours for half his crew, laying off 2 men who had been with the company longer than our marriage, and blaming me loudly to anyone who asked why the company was falling apart, saying his wife had betrayed him instead of admitting he had built the business on financial shortcuts and entitlement. I heard from a former employee that Ryan had spent an entire morning shouting into his office phone, trying to convince a supplier to give him one last extension. But the supplier had already seen the freeze notice and the fraud summary and refused to float a company that might be investigated next, and each refusal cracked another piece off the confidence Ryan once wore like armor. The twist came when they tried applying for a new line of credit at a different bank, hoping to outrun the red flags, but their application was pulled into secondary review almost immediately because the notes from Central Ohio Credit Union had already propagated through the shared risk networks, and the risk rating tied to Ryan's business had dropped so sharply that no institution with a functioning compliance department would touch them. I imagined Ryan sitting in that loan office, sweat gathering along his collar, as the banker explained that the flagged activity made them ineligible for funding. And for a moment, I felt the ghost of old pity flicker, but it vanished quickly, because these were consequences earned, not inflicted. It did not take long before the first audacity return appeared, the moment where people who once belittled me tried to fold themselves back into my orbit because they needed something, and it came in the form of an unexpected message from Carol asking if I could meet her and Ryan for coffee at a small cafe in a public plaza, the kind of place where they likely believed I would feel safer and more willing to help. Harriet reminded me the restraining order allowed contact only regarding financial matters, initiated respectfully and technically disqualified, so I agreed to meet them while keeping my guard high and my expectations low. When I arrived at the cafe, they were already seated. Ryan looking tired and drawn, his eyes carrying the dull haze of a man whose world was shrinking, while Carol wore an expression meant to evoke sympathy, but too polished to be sincere. And the moment I sat down, Ryan leaned forward, lowering his voice as if we were sharing a secret, rather than untangling the consequences of his own actions. He said the company was in trouble, but that it could be saved with the right restructuring. And then he offered a line I had heard versions of for years, saying, "You can fix this. You are good at this stuff. You always were," as if flattery might erase the bruise he had left on my cheek weeks earlier, or the forged signature that still sat in an evidence file. Carol nodded eagerly, adding that I had connections in lending, that I understood the system better than anyone, that all they needed was a little help getting approved again. And for a moment, the absurdity of it all washed over me, the realization that they still believed I existed to rescue them, that my skills were resources belonging to the family rather than parts of myself they had never valued until now. I let the silence stretch between us long enough for them to feel the weight of their own request. Then I folded my hands on the table and said quietly, "I already used my connections once. That is how you got your second chance. You spent it." And the words felt clean and precise, landing without anger, but with a finality they could not dodge. Ryan's face tightened, his jaw twitching as if he wanted to argue, but no argument he could offer would change the fact that the truth sat between us, like an undeniable ledger of every choice they had made. Instead of offering them a banker's contact or a restructuring consultant, I reached into my bag and placed a simple white card on the table, the card for a nonprofit legal aid organization that helped failing small businesses understand their options, and I slid it toward him slowly, watching his eyes follow it with confusion, then insult because he had expected me to open doors for him, not send him to stand in line with everyone else who had mismanaged their finances. I said, "This is the best place for you to start," and my voice held no malice. Only clarity, and the absence of anger seemed to unsettle him more than rage ever could have. Carol sputtered that they were family, and that family helps each other, but her words sounded flimsy in the shadow of everything they had done, and when I stood to leave, she reached for my arm but stopped herself when she remembered the restraining order, her hand hovering in midair before dropping back into her lap. Ryan muttered something under his breath, something that sounded like a blend of accusation and disbelief. But I did not turn back, because responding would have given him the power he no longer deserved. As I walked out of the cafe, the winter air hit my face crisp and clean, and I felt something inside me settle, a quiet understanding that this was the moment the audience needed to see, the moment where justice did not come from shouting, but from refusal, from calm boundaries so sharp they cut more deeply than revenge ever could. Behind me, Carol's voice carried faintly through the door, shrill and desperate, blaming me for everything collapsing around them. But the truth was beginning to speak louder than their lies, and as I stepped into the parking lot, I knew viewers watching this story would feel the shift too. The recognition that the Lorness were not just floundering, but truly paying the price for every injustice they had stacked across the years. 1 year passed, then a second, and the world around me shifted in ways that felt both slow and sudden, as if the ground beneath the Lorne family crumbled inch by inch, until the final collapse came all at once. And by the spring of 2026, their company was no longer a company at all, but a line item in a foreclosure notice posted on the county website. The kind of quiet public ending that does not make headlines, yet still marks the end of an era built on denial and borrowed time. Their office building, once painted in bright, confident colors, had faded under 2 winters of unpaid maintenance. The yard cluttered with rusted equipment and stacks of unsorted materials, and when the bank finally seized the property, it looked abandoned in spirit long before it was abandoned in law. I watched the process from a distance, not with spite, but with a clarity that comes from seeing patterns complete themselves. And during that same period, my own life was reshaping into something steadier, something grounded in the work I had always done in the shadows, but now stepped into openly. I had become a senior risk advisor, a role that allowed me to guide lending decisions from a higher vantage point, and I joined the board of a local housing nonprofit that partnered with the credit union to expand affordable housing options for women facing financial abuse, a mission that echoed the path I had been forced to walk years before. That position brought new responsibilities, new respect, and for the first time I stood in rooms where my knowledge was not mocked or minimized, but requested, valued, and used to shape real programs, and each step deeper into that world made me understand just how much I had carried alone, while the Lorne family treated me like a resource to be drained. The twist arrived quietly on a cold morning in February when the county published the auction list for foreclosed properties, and nestled between commercial lots and repossessed rental units sat one listing. I recognized instantly the small office and service yard that had once been the heart of Lorne Home Improvements, now reduced to a parcel number and a minimum bid that was shockingly low due to the condition of the property and the liens against it. I sat with that listing for a long moment, not out of sentiment, but because I could almost hear the echo of Ryan's voice bragging about how this place represented legacy and backbone and what he called real work. And now there it was, a forgotten asset up for sale to whoever bothered to show up. I made one call, then another, and through the same LLC I had used to protect my rental properties, I placed a quiet bid anonymous to anyone who might care and won the parcel without competition, the ownership transfer sliding smoothly into my portfolio like it had always belonged there. But instead of reopening it as a contractor space or flipping it for profit, I met with the director of the nonprofit and said I had a proposal, and within a month, the old office had been cleared, repainted, and reborn as something the Lorne family would never have predicted: a community housing office and financial literacy center, specifically for women rebuilding their lives after financial abuse, a place where they could learn how to protect themselves, how to grow savings, how to identify story financial red flags long before they became traps, and how to document everything the way I once had in the quiet of my home office. We named it June's House in honor of the aunt who had given me my first duplex and my first lesson in quiet strength, and the sign went up on a bright spring morning, crisp white lettering against a deep blue background that glowed in the sun. And as the crew finished adjusting the bolts, a car slowed on the main road, and I saw Lacey in the passenger seat, staring, her face tightening, as she read the sign again and again, her mind clearly working backward through old conversations until she connected the name June with the inheritance she once mocked. I did not approach her. I did not wave. I simply stood inside the office doorway, reviewing the program schedule, and the pride that filled me came not from triumphing over them, but from knowing this space would heal women they had never met. The real confrontation came later when Carol showed up unannounced, marching toward the entrance with a kind of frantic indignation, her voice sharp even before she reached me, demanding to know what I thought I was doing and accusing me of humiliating her family on purpose. She insisted that buying their old office was spiteful, that turning it into a women's money clinic was a targeted attack meant to embarrass them publicly. And she said these things with the same entitlement she had always used, the same belief that my choices existed in relation to their pride rather than my own purpose. I let her speak until her fury began to expend itself. Then I answered her quietly, because quiet truth often lands far deeper than shouting. And I said humiliation was when you laughed while your son hit me over my own savings. This is reclamation. And the silence that followed stretched wide enough to expose every crack in her confidence. She blinked rapidly as if trying to process the shift in power. And when she asked why I needed to drag their name into this, I pointed at the sign and said, "The only names on this building are mine, and June's yours only appear in your conscience." She stepped back. then her expression splintering as the understanding settled that this place existed not as a monument to their downfall, but as a home for justice that would outlast their bitterness. And as she walked away, I felt a strange calm settle in my chest, the knowledge that this was the true form of revenge through truth, the form that does not seek to destroy, but to rebuild something better in the space where harm once lived. Word spread quickly through the community, not in scandal, but in quiet respect, and within weeks the Lorne family realized they would spend the rest of their lives driving past a building that symbolized everything they had tried to suppress, and every time they saw the name June's house, they would be reminded that legacy is not built from arrogance or control, but from the choices we make when no one is watching. Ava Lorne had become a symbol of help and justice, while they had become a cautionary tale of fraud and abuse, and that imbalance was not cruel or triumphant. It was simply the natural ending of a long story, where the truth had finally been allowed to breathe. The morning light came in soft and warm through the sheer curtains of my kitchen, the kind of light that makes everything look gentler and cleaner. And as I stood at the counter rolling out the cinnamon dough, I felt an ease in my chest that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier, because now at 39 going on 40, this house was mine. In every legal and emotional sense, a place where the air no longer carried the tension of someone waiting to criticize me, and the floors no longer echoed with footsteps I feared, and the simple act of baking cinnamon rolls for the women arriving for today's money workshop felt like the final quiet stitch in a long mend of my own life. I worked slowly, letting the rhythm ground me, spreading the butter across the dough, sprinkling cinnamon and brown sugar in a steady line, rolling it into a log that felt heavier than it looked, slicing each circle and placing them on the tray while the smell of yeast and vanilla filled the room. And for a moment I thought about how, once I cooked under scrutiny, measuring my movements by someone else's temper, but now everything I did in this kitchen belonged only to me. The women who would be joining me soon were part of the group that met at June's house, women navigating the aftermath of toxic family dynamics and financial abuse, women who needed tools, and community women who needed a place where they could speak without being talked over. And I had built this weekly gathering into something steady and safe, something I wished I had found years ago, something I knew would outlive my own story. When the oven warmed and the rolls began to rise, I stepped into the small sunroom I used as a workshop space and glanced over the handouts I had printed last night, one titled, How to Spot Financial Abuse in Toxic Family, and another titled, Why Your Savings is Not Family Property by Default, each page lined with simple steps, examples, and notes about documentation and boundaries. And as I arranged the chairs in a loose circle, I could not help but notice how naturally the words revenge, emotional, and conflict, justice and betrayal, family karma wove themselves into the discussions we had week after week, not as bitterness, but as recognition, as shared vocabulary for pain that too many women had been taught to carry alone. The doorbell chimed softly, and I returned to the kitchen just as the first pan finished baking, sliding the rolls onto a cooling rack, while the warm scent spread through the house like a welcome banner. And when I opened the front door, 3 women stood there with notebooks in hand and cautious hope in their expressions, and I greeted them with the kind of calm affection that comes from knowing what it feels like to walk into a room still shaking from the weight of your own history. Over the next half hour, more women arrived, settling into the chairs with coffee mugs and quiet laughter, and I began the session with the story of a woman who had written to me earlier that week, her email sitting open on my laptop, the words still lingering in my mind because she had said, "Because of your story, I left my husband before he emptied my retirement account." And I read that line out loud to the group, watching their eyes widen, their shoulders lift slightly as if hearing someone else reclaim their life gave them permission to imagine the same for themselves. We talked through warning signs, through patterns of control and shifts in tone, through the difference between shared responsibility and coerced obligation, and as the women shared their own experiences, the room filled with a hum of recognition that felt like healing. Small, overlapping voices saying "me too," and I thought I was the only one, and I wish someone had told me sooner. As the conversation deepened, a new attendee slipped into the back of the room, a young woman with tired eyes and a hesitant posture, and when we broke for a short break, she approached me quietly to say she had once been a tenant in one of the rental homes owned by the Lorne Company before it collapsed, and she told me she remembered Ryan stomping through the property demanding late fees, even when maintenance requests went unanswered, and she said she had hoped he might have changed after everything that happened. She hesitated, then added that she had heard he now worked as a day laborer for another contractor, barely earning enough to keep his own rent paid, and that he looked worn down, smaller somehow, and I listened without interruption before answering gently. I hope he learned something from it that is between him and his karma now, and the woman nodded slowly, seeming to understand that forgiveness and consequence can coexist without canceling each other out. When the break ended, I brought out the cinnamon rolls, warm and glazed, arranging them on the table with fresh coffee. And as the women gathered around, I felt the full circle of the moment settle into me. Remembering a breakfast years ago, where humiliation and danger sat at the table like uninvited guests, remembering the way they had smirked, while I bled quietly inside, and now standing in a room where no one smirked, where no one mocked, where the only thing served was safety and solidarity, and the chance to build something stronger than what had been broken. The women ate slowly, talking about plans, about bank appointments, about credit repair, about boundaries they were finally ready to set, and I watched their faces transform in soft, real time, each bite, each word, each shared confession, layering into something that looked like resilience and felt like freedom. And when the session ended, they left with leftovers wrapped in foil and pages of notes tucked in their bags, promising to return next week with updates and new questions and quiet victories. After the last woman stepped through the door, I cleaned the table and returned to the kitchen, wiping crumbs from the counter, washing the mixing bowl, letting the warm water run over my hands, while the sun shifted across the room, and my voice quietly filled the stillness, as if finishing a thought that had taken 10 years to form. Saying this was never about burning everything down. It was about standing up for myself, choosing quiet justice over screaming matches, choosing silent revenge that lets the truth do the talking, and in the end, money did not give me dignity. It simply gave me a way to reclaim respect and close the chapter on a long lesson in betrayal. And as if speaking to an unseen listener, as if reaching through the screen to the women who would someday hear this story, I added, if you believe in revenge through truth in justice, without hate and in emotional resilience over staying small, tell me in the comments where you are watching from your story matters more than his reputation, and the words settled like a small earned peace in the house that finally felt like home.